Good morning.
Good morning.
Back a few months ago when I was discussing what this should look like for this Shuso period, discussing it with Hoko. We were talking about, rather than what I used to do was dig into koans, which was my old practice with my old teacher, and do something that was a little more in line with my history, I guess. I got a degree in fine arts here at IU in painting. It's been a long time ago now. I don't do much in the way of painting, but I feel like a lot of what I do it feels like the arts. I feel like I look at my work in the same way that I used to. I approach a lot of things more by looking at them and having an intuition or a gut feeling about them. I guess I'll start off. It seems like each Shuso kind of has an introduction, and I guess I need to introduce myself. Even though I feel like I'm with family here, it's still something I kind of feel like, because I'm sure there's plenty that you don't know about me. Well, I'm about 64, I'm going on 65, and I have some really early memories of art, of wanting to make art. Of course, little kids want to make art. It's just natural. I think all children are artists to begin with. I remember being probably 3 or 4, and of course being coached by my older sister how to stay in the lines with my coloring crayons. And when I was about 4 years old, I remember sitting on my dad's lap with a dime store toy. Had Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters on it. I think it was Quick Draw McGraw and Babaloo. And it was one of these, it was something you drew on. It was like a kind of tarry surface and then a cellophane thing, and you draw on it and then you pull it up and it disappears. And I remember sitting there in awe as my father copied the picture of Quick Draw McGraw on this thing. And of course I tried to do it. And I don't remember my success, but that was one of my earliest memories of finding a kind of joy in doing that kind of thing. And then in first grade, my first grade teacher, Mrs. Staley, had each of us in the classroom, we weren't a large class, each person would take a portion of a house and we draw it in colored chalk on the chalkboard. I got the chimney. I was one of the last kids. I got the chimney. I drew it in perspective, and I do the bricks in bond as they cross over. And she was amazed at this and had to express this to my parents at the parent-teacher conference. And from that point on, I was an artist. But I was always in art and science. I was one of these kids that always had microscopes and chemistry sets and drawing boards and easels and paints and all that stuff sitting around, so I was always messing around with it. And the other wonderful thing my parents did for myself and my 3 siblings was introduce us to the natural world. We spent a lot of vacation time traveling and camping, and some of my fondest memories are of going to various campgrounds in Indiana and around the country. And to this day, it is a part of my soul. I grew up in a really picturesque little valley near Lafayette with creeks and woods, fields. I spent hours outside on around the creeks, playing in the fields, building forts, doing the things little boys do. One of the things that I did with my siblings and neighbors, we would spend hours bent over the Weeaw Creek on a 2-board footbridge with our hands in the water, plucking frogs, toads, snakes, crayfish out, putting them in buckets and watching them. I have pretty fond memories of doing all that. And then in high school, in grade school and in high school, I was always the go-to artist guy. I designed the band logo, Wildcat, right on the jacket there, and would do the posters and banners and all that for the pep rallies. And the other thing that started happening in high school was I started meditating in kind of a weird way. I found it in a weird way. When I was a senior in high school, I was watching Kung Fu on television, and that really piqued my interest. I was already interested in most things Oriental. I liked the Japanese Zen aesthetic. I loved the Japanese houses and just thought they were so cool. And so I was kind of searching that sort of stuff out already. But in high school, I found a time, I know I told this story before, but it was within a few weeks of graduating. And things were getting pretty lax by then, and the teachers were ready to be done with this. And so I was inspired one day to just ask my English teacher if I could talk in front of the class. And what I had decided was that I was an atheist. And so I wanted to discuss that with my classmates in English class. And there were, well, what kind of brought me to that point was in the previous few years there was a big change. Everybody was becoming a born-again Christian. And even my best buddy, Bob Levitt, who was Jewish, had become a born-again Christian. And I just couldn't go there, and I was kind of like, had enough of it. And so I decided I was going to talk to the class about it. And I remember when I announced that I was an atheist, there were a couple of Pentecostal girls there, and they started crying. And it was a pretty lively conversation. And it was, I think at that point I realized that I was just kind of going in a little different direction. My meditation practice was pretty sporadic. You know, I would find myself in a bad place or a bad time, and instead of acting out, I think I would find myself walking through the woods or just finding a place to go sit down and think, and which kind of oftentimes turned into a meditation of sorts. In college, actually, what inspired me to go into painting was I started college immediately after high school, and after a semester I was put on probation. I was not a very good or very enthusiastic student. I'd had enough of school in high school. It was kind of a way to get away from home. So I quit for about 9 years. I moved to Vermont, and while I was in Vermont, there's a little tiny college, like it seems like there's a little community college or some kind of college in every little town in Vermont. And I started to get interested in painting, was trying to find a way to get into this school. I was not making very much money. I was a carpenter. So in frustration, I decided to just give it all up. I had moved there to be close to a girlfriend who was living in New York City. And that was actually part of the whole thing, was I would go down to New York for entertainment, especially while she was doing her classes. She was a grad student. I'd go to the Museum of Modern Art or the Met or something like that and spend a whole day just wandering around and just really absorbing everything I could. I was really attracted to the abstract expressionist. That was when I decided I wanted to go in that direction and took it upon myself to get there somehow. I knew I couldn't do it there because I couldn't afford it. Moved back to Indiana, moved to Yellowwood Forest, lived in my family's cabin, and got myself in school and started doing the fundamental classes, and then found myself in the BFA program here. And it was one of the most intense things I've ever done. It becomes such a completely personal thing when you are, what you do, what you feel like you're pouring your heart and soul into is criticized, critiqued. You stick it up on a wall and everybody stands around and talks about it and tears it apart or says they like it or whatever. Mostly they tear it apart. So that was a real eye-opener. I felt like I matured a lot, both as a person and as an artist while I was doing that. Well, I don't know where else to go with my history, except here I am now. Like I say, I still feel like I do art. I feel like my work is art. I design most of my jobs. It's instead of painting, it's very sculptural, but I find myself using some of the same skills that I had as I was maturing as a painter. And I worked at Pygmalion Art Supplies for the 4 years and a year after I was done here. So I had an opportunity to actually learn about materials. And I took something to heart one of my teachers said was that it's really hard to teach art, really impossible to teach art. And what you should really teach maybe, or what you students should be learning, is materials. Learn what you can do with the materials. That has always stuck with me. A respect for the materials, or just trying things. And one of the things that would happen within the critiques at school, people would do a painting and they'd sort of excuse it by saying, this was an experiment. I always felt like none of it's an experiment, or it's all an experiment. It depends on what direction you're coming from. But I felt like if you're going into this way, it is what it is. It's a total thing. Anyway, that maybe gave me the most sense of going in a professional direction at that point. I did do a certain amount of studio work, and I did sell some pieces. I did have quite a lot of work sitting around at one point. Most of it, I don't know where it is anymore. So, okay, I want to tie the arts to this practice. I think they're very connected. Listening to Stephen Batchelor recently on Being, Krista Tippett's program on public radio, he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't quite remember, but he said, as a religion, Buddhism is most like the arts. It fully embraces the self-generative, creative fluidity of this moment, this time. So it's as, and I'm adding this, so it's as expressions of this. We are creation and we are creators. I think it kind of also sits well with Dogen's comment on that we hear from the Ginjo Koan. We read from the Ginjo Koan. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be confirmed or actualized by myriad things. I guess I look at, in the most profound way, that doing art, making creation is the study of the self. And there was something that either John Cage or Pablo Picasso said, and I've said this before too, but I love it. It's about doing the work, how we go into a studio or we start to create. And I think this goes with any kind of creating, and how much studying the self, losing the self, engaging in what you're doing, how much is involved there. We go into the studio, we have our life, the weight of the world, all that's happening, the wars, the news, the bad news, good news, love affairs, relationships, all that's kind of trotting into the studio. Given time, you paint, you draw, you do a lot of messing around even before you get to that point. And you start to work. And you start to discard things. Things drop off. You start to focus. You forget about the world, forget about your relationships. All that is there is you and the painting or the sculpture or whatever it is. So all that stuff leaves. And if you're lucky, you leave. Only thing is, I haven't figured out how to give a talk with me leaving. So, I used to look at my studio as, I built my own studio. I acquired the property I had in Yellowwood Forest, was the family cabin. When I was in my late 20s, my father fell and broke his back, and he couldn't negotiate the hills of southern Indiana anymore. And I was done with school at one point, and I just offered to buy it, and because I loved it there. I still love it. I still go back there. So I added a second story to the house. It went from about 500 square feet to around 900 square feet. Next to it, I built a shop and a studio. Shop on the first floor, studio on the second floor. And I had a real sense of that studio as a kind of temple. It felt like a sacred space to me. It felt like a lot could happen there, and it was a place that I have to admit, I escaped from things. The way, there was no stair up to it. I had a ladder, and you went through a hatch. And I would crawl up there. It had tall ceilings and a skylight. It was kind of a perfect little space. And a tattered armchair that another artist had owned, and it's an artist that you can still see his work around town, pen and ink artist. Richard Thompson, I think, was his name. And I would sit in that and stare for hours and work and stare for more hours and find myself at all hours up there doing that. And only, now do I think about how much that was an investigation of me, a real investigation of this guy. I also rediscovered meditation around that time. It was still fits and starts, but it was still meditation. And then after a really troubling time, I found myself committing to it. I can tell you, it was March of 1990. I decided I was going to, I know you've all heard this story, I decided I was going to sit for a year, every day for a year, at least for 30 minutes. And I pretty much did that, except for the time around the holidays. And then I just didn't quit. I fancied myself as an abstract painter. I looked at people like Yves Kleiner, William de Kooning. It had, that kind of painting had a kind of flow and visceral attraction for me. Today I think about how it relates to visual, the visual in the Dharma for me. I think of the suffering that goes into making something like that. Okay, dukkha. I think of how many places, another way to think of dukkha is hindrance. I mean, that stuff, that all comes out when you're working. And another way to think of where this goes, there's dukkha, there's the hindrance, and then there's, I think, which is kind of like the opposite of it, sukha, which is non-hindrance, of course, or being stuck and flowing. And when painting really works, you're really flowing. And then there are the times that are like writer's block. You had painter's block or anything. Where do you go from here? Nothing's coming up. So at best, it just feels wonderful, meditative, flowing. You're completely there with it. And maybe you've left the room and it's painting itself. One of the things I was happy to receive recently was a huge Xerox manuscript from Hokussan, and it has been kind of a wealth of information, and it's spoken to me in a lot of ways. I was kind of bouncing around looking for ways to think about and to connect the arts to this practice that we do, that I've done for so long. I stumbled across Zenga, which I haven't dug that deeply into it yet, but Zenga is the priest, monk, artist, the expression of Zen, the most authentic expression. There are many people that represent this, and I can't remember their names right now, except for Ikkyu. I was always interested in his poetry and his art, and how playful his art was. Of course, Hakun, Zenji, others I can't really come up with right now. But this was something that was starting to be investigated by Westerners, I think, in the middle of the 19th century. There was, of course, a lot more cultural exchange beginning to happen, and Japan, I think, the arts were just beginning to be noticed. I mean, I remember hearing about Van Gogh actually encountering the Japanese block print idiom, because the items that were coming from Japan were often wrapped in discarded block prints on rice paper. So items would be sent from Japan, and so people would open these up and say, oh my God. You know, and that would be this kind of backdoor influence. And you can see it in Van Gogh's paintings. And there's some where he has direct reference, but in the colors and the fluidity of the images he has. So, you know, it came to the West, trickled to the West in kind of an interesting way. But I mostly today want to talk about painting, I mean, which is my love. But it Zenga touches many aspects of the arts. I mean, it's in the literature, it's in the No dance. No has been said to be like the embodiment of Zen, the body of Zen in dance. I've never seen a No dance, never actually seen one. It's something I'm curious now about at this point. To think about Zen Arts and try and compare it to just what I was doing, the way I thought of arts, the way I feel that other artists thought or think of their art. It's more an objective expression of Zen. As that Zen is present as a self-expressive, creative subject. In other words, that which is expressed itself and that which is expressed are identical. I guess if it were otherwise, it wouldn't be Zen. In the No Theater, it's a little different way to think about it. You know, my son is an actor, so I get his philosophy and spiel often when I encounter him. You know, you think about a villain, portraying a villain or a hero. The idea is that you're portraying this. You're not actually it. You're not embodying it. You're portraying this. I guess that's not the method acting. But I think, as my son talks about in his philosophy, that's kind of how he thinks of it. But there's still a detachment there. I think with the No or Zen embodiment of acting, the detachment is solely with the no self, the non-self. So it's coming from a different place. Again, it's finding that place where I'm not present doing this, where it is not me doing this, which is completely different than, you know, the way I used to think of it. In my art, I could not help but be there. I had to be, it was all filtered through me. Whatever mark I was making, it was coming through me. Now physically, the actual paintings differed from the typical Buddhist kinds of painting. The other paintings, other than the Zenga, would depict images of Buddhas or patriarchs, moments in the sutras. They'd be very formal, symmetrical, more as an object of reverence. They depict things as otherworldly. I think with the Zenga and the Zen way of painting, it would be more of an authentic expression, and as opposed to something being in very concrete form, not left to much interpretation. The Zen way of presenting oneself would offer something to be open-ended, or being able to interpret the wholeness of this experience within the painting. Usually in extremely simple things. Persimmons, flowers, birds, animals of all sorts. Some goofy master chopping down bamboo, you know, or a couple of old Chinese sages having a conversation. There would be no paradises, no pure lands, an actual world of self-awakened. So, given that, there's so many stories out there, awakening can occur in the most mundane circumstances. So, these mundane images, painting flowers, a fish splashing in water, for every condition of the actual world may serve to create the possibility for such an event to awaken. A pebble hitting bamboo. How does one paint deep silence? A frog jumping into a pond. The most immediate things. There's no Shakyamuni descending from the heaven. There's no Dogen sitting on a cloud. So the occasions and the ways within this art to awaken are numberless. Zenga, it endeavors to reveal directly Buddhadharma on the empty formlessness that is any form. It's true self. It is the direct indication of the formless self that Zen's cultural uniqueness lies. I've seen a lot of this stuff and not realized that I was looking at it. And just being automatically attracted to it, pouring through the books and being at the museums, you'd see these occasional pieces and just utterly simple and perfect in their execution. In a few lines, there's a fish, a bird, a flower, persimmons. I think it is those, there's something so ungraspable that lends these as more profound than most anything else that I look at or want to see. They, of course, accessible too, because they're the easiest kinds of things to go into. But I think you don't realize that you're actually entering. You don't realize that you're becoming part of the painting. And that's also part of the beauty of this kind of work. It's the kind of painting that can only come from someone aware and awake, and whose main concern is with this empty being, or formless self. One of the things that really turned me off to the art world when I was getting into it, of course I had access to all the magazines, and I had teachers who were either famous or semi-famous. They talk about being within the business of art, and they would be thinking about the dollar way too often. And the gallery owners, the dealers, would be thinking about the dollar. One of the things that would happen would be a kind of inauthenticity, because the artists were required to create things that sell. If you're creating towards that, I don't think you're really creating. You're not being authentic, obviously. So that's why I say it can only come from somebody, this kind of work, and its attraction can only come from somebody who's aware and awake, aware of the world, aware of a kind of necessity to do something that's authentic, a formless self. That creative subject expressing itself. That which paints is that which is painted. We could apply this to anything. I could apply it to a lot of things I do. To be authentic, pour your heart out into something. Truly expressionistic. An expressionistic painter. That's what I used to think of myself. For Zen, the actual free expressions of this formless self become the living scriptures of the immediate present. I can't believe I actually said that.
Would you say it again, please?
For Zen, for a Zenny, let's put it that way, the actual free expressions of this formless self become the living scriptures of the immediate present. I guess in the best sense, that's when I'm working or doing anything, that's what I want to be happening. When I'm encountering somebody, we're having a great conversation. That's just coming out of what we're both creating, what we're both doing with each other. It's kind of a wonderful thing when that happens. All of a sudden you find yourself sitting for hours talking about things, and you have said volumes and gone places in each other's heads that you don't normally go. It's an art, that conversation, that kind of conversation, art in itself that you don't know you're doing. In this Xerox tome that Hoko gave me, there's a point where it comes to describing the characteristics of Zenga and Zen Art. And like I said, this came out of really Europeans. I think it was, I can't remember the people, maybe I can come up with it later. I think there was some German philosopher that was beginning to see this and was starting to canonize what it was about this particular art that was so attractive. And broke it down into 7 categories. And it really kind of sounds like sounds a bit like precepts when I say it. The 7 characteristics. Again, this started out of started in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, as the Oriental arts started to trickle into Europe. So there were several people that were really starting to look at this stuff. And I think one of the first things that they started to notice was a kind of asymmetry that would take away from the formality of the previous kind of painting, even the formality of the religious iconographical painting of the West. So characteristics, 7 characteristics are asymmetry, simplicity, austere sublimity or lofty dryness, naturalness, subtle profundity or profound subtlety, freedom from attachment and tranquility. And there's not supposed to be any significance to this order. It's like you can take any one of these works and you can apply these 7 characteristics and they should include them all, apparently. I think you could spend a whole lot of time doing that instead of just enjoying the work. But just starting with asymmetry, I mean, it's kind of obvious what it is, but one of the things I found myself doing as an artist was that there would be a kind of balance that happened. And early on in the formal study, you learn about the golden mean, and it's a way of dividing up a rectangle. And I forget what the ratios are, but for me it was always kind of an instinctual thing. You just felt that's the right place to put that pot of flowers or something like that. It just felt right. And so you gave yourself up to your gut, mostly. Just to draw the distinctions, an irregular, unbalanced composition also becomes informal. It's much more accessible. I think it lends much more to the authentic spirit. And it's that authenticity is completely counter to the formal. The authenticity that comes from Zen practice or a Zen way of engagement is kind of in the heart of the irreverence of our practice. We don't bow to the statue. We bow in reverence to all things when we bow to the statue of the Buddha. Recently, I remember a conversation talking about the Zen master. He was chastised by a priest for taking the wooden Buddha and throwing it in the fire because he was cold. And so I've always been attracted to that kind of irreverence in this. It brings a kind of reality to my own practice and brings me down, keeps me on earth. So we don't embrace the holy in this. It can mean a kind of deformity, but it can also mean taking a formal space and activating it with a kind of imperfection. Japanese concept of wabi-sabi. You have all this incredible, another thing that attracted me to Japanese arts is the architecture, the temples, the houses, all this perfect, beautiful woodwork, and respect for the wood, and just beautifully put together and fitted. And then, this one wacky, crooked beam going across the ceiling. It just activates the whole space. And of course, then there's my okesa here. Perfectly sewn, I must say. Each stitch right next, just the right distance and the right size from the next one. So Hojo-san had to put a big red dot up here to show how imperfect this thing is. As within the arts, I guess I'd like to think of this practice, it's another conversation we've had around here, as a religion of this reality. It's not something out there, it's not a pure land or a heaven, it's this reality. So I think what we do in our daily lives is kind of bank against the imperfections of ourselves and what our circumstances are, and constantly want for something that is perfect, what we view as perfect. It's hard to think of this moment being absolutely perfect as it is. Simply because it can't be any other way than what it is at this moment. Of course, Suzuki Roshi says we're all quite perfect as we are, but we could all use a little improvement. But I think it's easy to kind of see Dogen's talk in the Shobo Genzo on time being, and think about how the Dharma is evolving and devolving all the time. If we're sitting within our soup of reality, we don't have to think about it evolving and de-evolving, but it's sure noticeable at times. It's certainly noticeable at this age. To continue on with the aesthetics, thinking about simplicity next. First was the asymmetry, now it's simplicity. Simply put, as sparse essentials. It's the idea of not a single thing, or the one, applied to this Zen aesthetic. It can be applied to this Zen aesthetic. It can be read as releasing one grasping, releasing one's grasping, and freedom from clutter. So therefore there's nothing limiting. It becomes boundless. We're talking about the visions, the ideas that you have something within the painting. Again, fish, persimmons, flowers, a bird. Most of them have a kind of reverberation within that painting. It activates the space. But the space isn't within that square. You get a sense of that space goes beyond the borders of that paper. I think when it best performs that simplicity, that one thing, which is not one thing, it opens this up to the boundlessness of what that paper is, what that painting is. Kind of like thinking of the sky without the clouds. It's boundless. Or thinking of the sky that's untroubled by the clouds. The next aesthetic is austere sublimity, or lofty dryness. I have to admit, this one cracks me up. I think you can think of this as a kind of maturity. All the extraneous, all the things that aren't necessary have been worn away. It's kind of like sit for 10 years, and then sit for 10 more, and then sit for 10 more. And it's, in my mind, this practice, when I am practicing well, it's a kind of zeal for practice. It's what brings me here in the early morning or every Sunday. It's during sesshin when we sit, and then we sit more, and then we sit more, and then we go eat, and then we come back and we sit more, and we keep sitting, and we keep sitting. And there's a point where the boredom wears away, and I can have this mind of not enough, not yet enough, not yet enough, and just be able to sit with that. I feel like it's a kind of tempering that happens. We're freed of the detritus, eventually and at times allowed to go completely to the essence of whatever it is, being well seasoned. The disappearance of all childishness and inexperience. And sometimes being childish and inexperienced is pretty instructive when you're an artist. But I think in the end it's also a huge hindrance. It also means the right amount at the right time. It's like oryoki. I've heard it explained, I'm not really sure what. I've heard oryoki mean just Buddha bowl. It's called the oryoki bowl. But it also means the right amount. Thank you for concurring. The fourth aesthetic is naturalness, not being artificial, obviously. This does not emanate from accident. It means it's fully immersed in intention between the artist and the object. This is a little hard for me to wrap my head around, but I can see this. It means that it's an unforced creative expression where there's no difference between creation and creator. Again, there's that. Art and artist without conscious effort. I do something in my work I call dead reckoning that doesn't happen very often, but it usually happens when I've been on something for a while and I'm really troubled by how to do it. It happens sometimes when there's a piece of trim or something that needs to be fit in a really weird, difficult place that you can't measure it, you can't use any kind of tool to do it with, you just have to do it. And I'll ignore it for a while, and then I'll be troubled by it because it has to happen. And then finally, I'll just cast everything to the wind and just jump in and do it. And sometimes it's very successful, and you haven't ruined a piece. You haven't messed it up. Of course, you mess it up too. Part of that messing up is where you're finding out your limits. But it seems like when I do that kind of thing, it's a surprise as much as anything too. Subtle profundity, deep reserve, another characteristic of this aesthetic. I think it's, you can look at this as a kind of engaged inference. You know, it talks about the boundlessness of the work itself. It also leaves a lot to the person who is viewing the work. It allows them the sense, the maturity to see what you're doing there, or to see the sense of the profundity. It gives way to whatever the work is. I guess that's kind of leads to that judgment. It's kind of impossible to think about how this would be something that's easily to produce as much as to realize. I'm not going to stand back and say, my, that has subtle profundity to it. I think it's that you realize that you're affected. And I guess for me, personally, at its best, I see painting as performing. When my painting is good and right, it becomes something that is mutable within a static platform. When a painting is good, it moves within the experience of whatever the person is, whoever's viewing it. That means that it is physically the same piece, but the viewer's changed each time. I think it's wonderful to be able to live with really good art. You know, if you have friends that paint or do sculpture, ceramics, or anything, to live with something that is an ungraspably beautiful object, you don't know where it comes from, but you live with it because each time you encounter it, you're changed. Your dialogue changes with the work. You have changed each time you come back to it. In my own painting, I like when it works for me, and when it's hopefully working for others, it becomes like a kind of flowing poetry. I'm trying to think of the poet right now. The Four Quartets. Who did the four quartets?
Shuso.
Yes. That's one of those group of poems I can sit down and read, and each time it's something different. Each and every time it's something different. I go to completely different places. The words are slippery around a kind of framework. And that, to me, is the way I want painting, my painting or anybody's painting, the kinds of stuff that I want to live with, to work. I think otherwise it becomes, your work just becomes decorative or a kind of pop art or something like that. This is I'm going to move on to freedom from attachment. I think this is the sixth characteristic. Obviously, it connects pretty quickly with our practice. But as an aesthetic, it's important as a cultural expression of Zen also. Here, freedom from attachment means unbound to habits, rules, formulas, or convention, unconstrained in thinking and action. Not attached to gods or Buddhas, yet I think another way to think of this is in the subject-object dichotomy. As a painter, it's sort of rehashing what I've been talking about. That dichotomy disappears in the best sense, as when you're creating the works or when you're viewing the works. And maybe to look at the other side of this, to think of preciousness as attachment to it. I remember when I first started to make things that I thought were really wonderful, I'd become so impressed with them and they would become precious to me. And, if they were precious long enough, I'd get sick of them, which is a really good exercise. But preciousness is, in essence, attachment. We attach to something and we've separated ourselves from it. It is my object. It is this thing I'm in love with. And that's not to say you can't love what you're looking at, but to possess it, you've already distanced yourself. The final Zen aesthetic, number 7, is tranquility. Most of this work, Zenga, these paintings, for me, provide this quality of quiet and calm. It's a respite, be able to see it, to live with it. It's, of course, that quiet and calm. In sign language, I learned a certain amount of sign language years ago in Vermont. My girlfriend at the time was getting a degree in deaf psychology at NYU. So at her inspiration, I went to Austin School for the Deaf and learned from teachers there a few things, and then later engaged my son's mother, who's deaf. The sign for peace is a combination of signs. It's quiet and calm, and that is the description of tranquility. And like in orientation before a sesshin, one of the things that Hojo-san often says is, during sesshin, try not to disturb others and try not to be disturbed by them. Don't be disquieting, don't be disquieted. And that's a pretty good description of what tranquility is. Related to these visual arts, it means it's quality conducive to contemplation. And it gives us, especially living with it, a space to go deep within the moment. I think that's as far as I'm going to go with this. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Well, thank you, everyone.